These are the top 10 pass rushers of the 2010s. Last week, I did my top 10 receivers of the 2010s. I'm going to try and get through the entirety of this decade, every single position group, but without further ado, let's get started. Actually, I lied. There is a further ado. I do want to make a quick note that I did give a slight boost to guys that got pressure from the interior, guys that were primarily 3-techs, just because I do think, and I think a lot of people would agree with me here, that it is a little bit more difficult to generate pressure and get sacks from that position. At number 10, I have Clay Matthews, who was truly a dominant force in 2010, and this was the year the Packers won the Super Bowl, but during the regular season, Clay had 13.5 sacks, 18 tackles for loss, and was second in Defensive Player of the Year voting, and then of course he had an amazing stretch in the playoffs as well. This of course including maybe the biggest play possible in the Super Bowl. As far as the rest of this decade goes for Matthews, incredibly impressive, 81.5 sacks, 110 total tackles for loss. He also had 6 picks, which is the highest mark on this list, but it wasn't something that I was even thinking about. It just happens to also be true, but we're talking about pass rushers. It shouldn't really matter, but I guess I'm not doing a very good job of looking at that because number 9 on this list, Justin Houston, also seemed to have some interceptions as well. Sometimes edge defenders find their way into passing lanes or the ball gets tipped around a bunch and lands in their arms. It is what it is. But I can assure you, it's Justin Houston's 22 sack season in 2014 and nearly 90 sacks total during this decade that land him at number 9 on this list, not his 4 cumulative interceptions. He does only have the one singular All-Pro season, but considering there are only 5 players ever to have a 22 sack season, it would feel like a mistake to leave him off. But a quick side note to go along with that, Jared Allen did have a 22 sack season in 2011. He will not be on this list because most of his success was prior to this decade, prior to the 2010s. At number 8, I have Calais Campbell, who is the first interior defender to make an appearance on this list. And like I said earlier, I am giving these guys a bonus for being able to wreak such havoc and generate so much pressure from a generally tougher role. Because it is just so wildly impressive for Calais Campbell to have a 14.5 sack season, to have 81 total sacks during this decade, which is right there with Clay Matthews. He also had 141 tackles for loss, which ranks second across this decade. And yes, I know that does take into account run defense as well, but it's so proficient, it's so prolific that I think it's worth being noted. Now, as we move on to number 7, we're going to be taking a look at the first of 4 players to win a Defensive Player of the Year. And you all know that I can't stand the Ravens, but I gotta give credit to Terrell Suggs. I just know that if I left Suggs off this list, I would never be able to show my face in sports again. In 2011, he had 14 sacks, forced a league-leading 7 forced fumbles, and, of course, 1 Defensive Player of the Year. And then, of course, the rest of his tenure during this decade was far from lackluster, spent most of his time in the backfield, took quarterbacks down 81.5 times, and had 5 seasons with double-digit sack totals. Now at number 6 on this list, we're going to actually talk about another Defensive Player of the Year winner, Khalil Mack, who actually could have won it for 2 different teams. So obviously we have the time spent with the then Oakland Raiders, and that was amazing, truly special. Went back-to-back first-team All-Pro and of course won Defensive Player of the Year in 2016. He then goes to Chicago, is still amazing, gets another first-team All-Pro, but only finishes second in Defensive Player of the Year voting. Mack just has this stretch from 2015 to 2018 where he's in conversations to be the best edge defender in football, and even though the run wasn't as long as some of the other guys on this list, the dominance is very apparent. At number 5, I have Cameron Wake, who never received any Defensive Player of the Year considerations, but I think was just too good for too long to leave off of this list. He was one of 4 players on this list to have over 90 sacks during this decade, and he had 95 of them. But there was a point about midway through the 2015 season where things really went south for Wake after he tore his Achilles against the Patriots. He of course misses the remainder of this season, but then returns to record back-to-back double-digit sack seasons and makes a strong case for Comeback Player of the Year in 2016, although he loses it to Jordy Nelson. To me, that just deserves so much credit. Managing to be a very present and productive pass rusher after an Achilles tear is remarkable. And that could have ended his career like 4 years earlier than it did, but he still managed to be incredible afterwards. That just shows the kind of player and person that Cameron Wake is. We're making our way through our top 5 now. As we move on to number 4, I have Chandler Jones. And when we talk about dominant stretches like we did with Khalil Mack, Chandler Jones has to be talked about in that regard as well. His run from 2015 to 2019 is some of the most impressive pass rushing production you'll see in any decade, let alone just this one. In 2017, he leads the league in sacks with 17, and he leads the league in tackles for loss with 28. And then in 2019, he pairs a 19-sack season with a league-leading 8 forced fumbles. And now that I'm reading back at my script, I'm realizing how weird it is that he had a 17-sack season in 2017 and a 19-sack season in 2019. Like, imagine if he was just now entering his prime, he'd probably go 23, 24, 25, dog. What? But let me get back on track. He had 5 straight double-digit sack seasons during that 5-year stretch that we're talking about, and he had 6 total during this decade. Chandler Jones led all players during this decade with 27 forced fumbles, and actually is tied with total sacks accumulated during this decade with 96. Though I'm not going to tell you who he's tied with, because we haven't talked about that player yet, and I don't want to ruin the surprise. So don't go scrolling to the end of this video, and don't go looking it up. All right. Now we're entering the top 3, and everyone knows who the top 3 is going to be. Maybe the order is a little bit debatable, but forget about pass rushing for a second. If we're going to talk about just the most dominant seasons over this decade, we have to talk about number 3 on this list, Aaron Donald. Now, you might think this is too low for Aaron Donald, and you might be right. It might not matter that he didn't play this entire decade because he's been arguably the best player in football for quite some time now. Defensive Rookie of the Year in 2014. Back-to-back Defensive Player of the Year awards in 2017, 2018, 5-time first-team All-Pro defender in a row during this stretch. We were just getting completely unreal, scorched earth, best player in the world type of performances from Aaron Donald, so it doesn't matter that he was an interior defender. It doesn't matter that he was drafted in 2014. He's got to be top 3 on this list. Absolutely. And Aaron Donald's going to go down as one of the best defensive players ever, but I think it would be unfair to number 1 and number 2, who were just as dominant during this decade, to put Aaron Donald above them. I think it would be a little bit unfair. At number 2, I have Von Miller, and I think you could make an argument for pretty much any of the top 3 to be number 1 just off accolades alone, and Von has one trophy in his case that particularly stands out. He has a Defensive Rookie of the Year. Very impressive. He's a 3-time first-team All-Pro player. Very impressive. He's a Super Bowl MVP, man. And this whole playoff stretch, really, for Von was generational. He had 5 sacks over the course of 3 games, just completely jarring, and everyone knows what he did to Cam Newton in the Super Bowl. Oh, and did I mention that he's the only player on this list to have over 100 sacks during this decade? Because he is. And he had 7 double-digit sack seasons. I think if there was like a prototypical edge rusher in the NFL, it was Von Miller. Now, before we get to number 1, even though I know many of you probably already know who it is at this point, I do still want to give some honorable mention credit to some of the other guys that I was considering to put on this list. There were a lot of really great pass rushers during this decade, and I think guys like Jason Pierre-Paul, DeMarcus Ware, and Robert Quinn all have some claim to this list, even though they weren't explicitly in the top 10. But number 1 on this list is none other than J.J. Watt, who despite missing most of 2016, 2017, and 2019 due to injuries, he was still tied for second on this list in sacks with Chandler Jones. This is who I wasn't trying to spoil earlier because he's number 1 on the list. Now, originally, I was going to give Von Miller the edge on this list. Get it? Edge rusher, pass rusher. It's funny. You can laugh just because of the consistency that I knew was required in order to get a 100-sack decade. But I want you to hear this about J.J. Watt. He's the only player in NFL history to get 20 sacks in a season twice. He's not the first to do it. He's not the first to get 20 sacks. He doesn't have the most sacks. Hell, he doesn't even have the most on this list, but he's the only person to do it twice. Watt also has 3 Defensive Player of the Year awards in his trophy case, and at the end of this decade, only one other player in NFL history could make that claim, and that was Lawrence Taylor, though Aaron Donald joined that group in 2020 as well, both of which are 2 of the best defensive players ever, by the way. So when I'm stacking up resumes, and I see J.J. Watt has 5 first-team All-Pros, oh, but so does Aaron Donald, and I see Watt has 5 double-digit sack seasons, oh, but Von has 7, and he has the Super Bowl MVP, the thing that really separates J.J. Watt is accomplishing things that few to none ever could. But that wraps up my top 10 pass rushers of the decade. Make sure you comment and let me know what position group you want me to take on next. And until next time, thank you all for tuning in. And I'll catch you guys on the flippity flop.